Good afternoon. Happy fall. We're back. We're glad to be back in this beautiful, beautiful building. Oh, and we came at a great day. You know, we watched that beautiful Bellissima leave this building. I don't know if anybody got a chance to see one of those cars in the hallways. It was awesome. It's just like a car in the hallway. I know we sort of had to rearrange how we do everything, but it was worth it, right? To know that we're in a place that would bring an exhibit such as the exhibit we're going to talk about today and the exhibit that's driving away today. So I'm glad that we have such a wonderful place here in Nashville and a place that Vanderbilt gets to support. So thank you all for being here today. For those who don't know me, my name is Gail Carr-Williams, and I'm Associate Director of Community, Neighborhood, and Government Relations at Vanderbilt University. And we are so pleased to have this partnership with the Frisch Center, our Food for Thought 3-part lunch series that we do fall. I think this is our fourth year. It seems funny how fast the time goes by. In any event, so happy to be here, but just a few things before I turn it over to my colleague Megan for this absolute wonderful panel. Now that you're here in this beautiful building, you had an opportunity to see it, think about a membership to the Frisch. Shameless plug, I know, but it's a great place to have a membership, a great place to go, and a great place to share with your family. Speaking of other shameless plugs, it's really not shameless because it's a very cool place. I mean, the gift shop. The gift shop is awesome here. You find things in here that you can't find many other places, so I would also suggest you take the opportunity to browse through the gift shop. And when you browse through the gift shop, you'll be able to see some of the absolute amazing, beautiful pottery of one of our panelists, Susan DeMay, today. So our very own local and beautiful art, and you'll get to hear more and talk more about that. But the Frisch Center is a great place. It's a great place for Nashville, and on behalf of Vanderbilt and on behalf of the Frisch Center, I think I can sort of say welcome and glad you're here and look forward to seeing you at our next lunch boxes. So at this, I turn it over to Megan to introduce our panel and present our good discussion today.
Thank you so much, Gail.
Thank you, Megan.
The Frisch Center would love to thank Vanderbilt's Office of Community, Neighborhood, and Government Relations, Gail Carr-Williams, Chandra Allison, Midori, and Carol for all the work that they do to make this program possible. So thanks to them, and thank you all for being here. I'm so pleased to welcome you to our first panel for this season. Today we'll be discussing Women, Art, and Social Change, the Newcomb Pottery Enterprise. And Gail has assembled a wonderful panel to join me on stage. I'll be moderating. My name is Megan Robertson. I'm the Associate Curator of Interpretation here at the Frisch Center. And today I'm joined by Susan DeMay, who's a ceramicist and professor in the Department of Art at Vanderbilt University, Vivian Green-Fried, who's a professor in the History of Art Department at Vanderbilt, and Trinita Kennedy, a curator here at the Frisch Center, who was responsible for organizing women, art, and social change in our galleries. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Trinita to tell us a little bit more about this exhibition and get us started for our conversation.
The exhibition focuses on works of art made in the southern city of New Orleans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Prior to the Civil War, New Orleans had been one of the biggest cities in the United States and the largest city in the South, but beginning in the late 19th century, its position began to decline. Newcomb Pottery in New Orleans was one of more than 100 art potteries established in the years around 1900 in the United States. Many cities had art potteries, and a few, such as Boston and Cincinnati, had more than one. There was even a Nashville art pottery in the 1880s, and it was actually located here within the neighborhood of the Frisch Center. Newcomb Pottery was one of the longest lasting and largest of its kind. It was in operation from 1895 until 1940, and it is estimated to have produced at least 70,000 works. Newcomb Pottery is unique for being part of an education institution for women in the South, which is Newcomb College. The pottery was made by faculty, undergraduate and graduate students, and graduates in the art department. It offered an unprecedented opportunity for Southern women to train as artists, and it was intended as a path for employment at a time when there were few other options for women. Historic photographs blown up and interspersed throughout the exhibition help tell this story. All the photographs we used were taken when Newcomb College was located in the Garden District on Washington Avenue in New Orleans between the years 1892 and 1918. In the photograph here, you see a group of students in a classroom in the Pottery Building in pottery decorating class, and many of them are working on a tall vase similar to the one that you see in our exhibition pictured on the left, which is by an artist named Harriet Coulter Joor, one of the most talented of the Newcomb decorators. The classroom was specially designed for pottery decorating and provided a beautiful, well-lit environment in which to do inspired work. Newcomb pottery was deliberately a Southern product. It was made in the South, primarily by Southern women who used Southern clays. The motifs are almost exclusively the floral and fauna of the Gulf South and include daffodils, coastal violets, oriental poppies and blue crabs, rabbits, and fish. Actually, one of the things that really occurred to me as I was assembling this slide is that the focus is never on the human figure, and thus the pottery safely avoided the problem of teaching women to study the nude. This slide shows a selection. This is actually a legitimate concern at the time, teaching women how to draw from the nude. And so this slide shows a selection of early Newcomb pottery made before 1910, when the Newcomb palette and style were established. Cobalt blue and sage green predominate, with yellow also being an important color. The motifs are large and repeated, and the glaze is shiny and clear. A wide variety of shapes were made, but all were simple forms. Although first and foremost works of art, the works were also functional and intended for a domestic interior. The exhibition surveys the entire history of Newcomb pottery and also includes examples of works made after 1910, when a matte glaze was introduced. Many other American potteries, including Rokewood and Gruby, were using matte glazes at the time, and they were appreciated for being restful on the eyes. The women kept up to date with the latest artistic trends and always sought to remain current with new concepts of modern design. In the bowl on the left, we see Art Deco motifs, popular in the 1920s and 1930s, and the vase on the right features a repeating floral motif and is an experiment in abstraction. Newcomb pottery was a quasi-commercial enterprise. The pottery was sold and the women were paid. Archival research has shown that the women were paid less than at other major art potteries, and their work was priced lower as well. Not all the women sought to make a living off their work, and those who did struggled. We know that many of them lived at home with their parents, and some were married and did not have to be truly self-supporting. To maintain standards, the faculty judged each work, and only if it passed was it placed for sale. This photograph shows the sales room at Newcomb Pottery. After 1900, there were sales agents all over the United States, from San Francisco to Boston, including in Chattanooga and Knoxville, Tennessee. Also after 1900, Newcomb Pottery began systematically marking its wares on the bottom with an NC for Newcomb College, and with other ciphers, including most importantly that of the woman who decorated the piece. Newcomb Pottery also employed a sticker that emphasized that each work was unique and made in New Orleans. So here you can see a sticker on the bottom. Beginning in the first decade of the 20th century, Newcomb Pottery began diversifying and producing other arts and crafts besides pottery, including jewelry and metalwork, embroidery, book arts, including illustration, book plates, and book binding. They also produced calendars and greeting cards. And many of the same motifs that were used in the pottery were also used in the other arts and helped to contribute to the recognizable Newcomb style.
And so Trinita, I think it would be helpful, thank you so much for painting that picture of kind of the wares of Newcomb and its history, but if you could tell us a little bit more about the circumstances of the college's founding and who the college was specifically meant to serve.
So Newcomb College was the first degree-granting women's coordinate college in the United States. Harvard actually had an annex earlier, what eventually became Radcliffe College. However, it wasn't a degree-granting institution until after Newcomb came along. So Newcomb was under the umbrella of Tulane University, a school which began as a public medical college in the early 19th century and became a private university with a donation from Paul Tulane in 1882. And Newcomb would serve as a model for other women's coordinate colleges, including Barnard at Columbia and Pembroke at Brown. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, there has been a merger between Tulane and Newcomb, and there is now one undergraduate college for both schools. So Newcomb College was founded by the woman you see on the right. Her name is Josephine Newcomb, and she was a wealthy widow whose two children both died young. She had a son who died as an infant and a daughter who died at 15 of diphtheria. And the college is named in honor of the daughter, Harriet Sophie Newcomb. And Ella, the painting here on the right is actually by one of the Newcomb artists. I think it's very interesting to note that the donation that Josephine Newcomb made to Tulane University specifically stated that the college was to be for white women. Paul Tulane also specified that his donation was to be for white persons, and Tulane and Newcomb did not integrate racially until the early 1960s, and in fact, they integrated after the New Orleans public school system did. The student population at Tulane has historically been predominantly Protestant. So in 1919, about 62% of the students identified as Protestant, 20% as Catholic, and 12% as Jewish. So Newcomb College has long had a Jewish student population, and unlike many schools in the Northeast, there was no quota placed on Jewish students. So that is one area where the school has been particularly progressive.
And so really, Newcomb College being founded in this period, it has a very specific student in mind. It's looking to educate young middle-class women, women who would have been categorized in their day as a lady, so someone who isn't working in domestic work or in a factory setting. And this seems like a really kind of foreign concept to us, I think, as a modern audience, this exclusivity and this narrow slice for a public institution to serve. And so I think it would be helpful at this point if Vivian, who's a professor of art history, to give us a little peek about what exactly the people who founded Newcomb were thinking in this period and why they had these kind of prejudices about what a lady was supposed to look like and do.
Well, thank you. We had met earlier to talk about some of our ideas, but Trinita didn't say anything about not representing the body. And if I knew that she was going to say that, I would have brought in an image by the artist Thomas Eakins that some of you might be familiar with. But Thomas Eakins was a prominent artist at the end of the 19th century who lived in Boston and also commuted with New York. In Philadelphia, he lived in Philadelphia and went to New York a lot. And he taught at the Philadelphia Academy of Fine Arts. He was a major teacher and artist, and he was teaching a class and believed that both male and and female students should be able to study the male nude. And that's in the academic tradition. If you're going to become an artist in the 19th century, you were going to want to create usually a history painting that would give a narrative about an important historical event, and you would have figures, and the figures would be heroic, and it would be based on your studying first ancient sculpture and then an actual nude figure. Women were not allowed into the academy in Europe and in the United States until the end of the 19th century. So Thomas Eakins is one of the first teachers to teach women students. And when he removed the loincloth of a male model in 1886, he was fired from the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. So all of the pottery that you're seeing here, it's dealing with the very themes that women are associated with. So at this particular period of time, there was really a division between men and women. And when women were believed to, and I'm talking about white middle-class women or upper-class women. This wouldn't be for working women on a farm or in a factory, for example. But for middle-class white women or upper-class white women, the cult of true womanhood was the dominant ideology, and you would, it consisted of piety, purity, domesticity, and submissiveness. And so, and you all know in terms of how women dressed in ways in which their bodies are completely covered. So, and it's manifest here in this wonderful illustration by Winslow Homer from Harper's Weekly. It's done during the Civil War, and what I want to point out is that you're looking at these women in their domestic roles. So here, it is during the Civil War, they're not on the front, they are at home darning socks or writing letters to their loved ones, or they are nursing, or nuns nursing, helping to write letters to somebody who's very, very ill. So this work by Homer, who is a contemporary of Eakins, is really it's illustrating exactly what I'm talking about. Men and women lived in two separate worlds, except when they were home together. And that's manifest here. You've got the men here, and they're the soldiers, but the women are cleaning for them. And they're not going to be joining them when they're actually on the front. Whereas here, you're seeing the men, they're ill, the women are taking care of them. But again, women are going to be, they're in this domestic caretaking sphere rather than any other sphere. Here is a Thomas Eakins. There we go. I forgot I brought him in. This is a work of art by Thomas Eakins. And Amelia Van Buren, in fact, was an artist who studied with Eakins. And you're seeing her seated in the chair. And this is a work of art by John Singer Sargent. I'm bringing these two paintings in because they're really showing you this idea of the cult of true womanhood. They're located in the domestic sphere. Not only are they located in the domestic sphere, but they seem to be trapped in that space. So that for Sargent's painting, this woman is on this couch, and you don't have a sense that she's going to be able to move from it. In fact, she doesn't seem as if she has any thoughts in her mind. And furthermore, if you take a look at what she's wearing, it matches the setting that she's located in. That's not accidental. A woman who, if she's going to be meeting somebody, if somebody's going to come calling, would dress in something that would allow them to merge into their interior decoration. So women, keep that in mind the next time you have a dinner party. And we're supposed to create this comfortable, pious home for their husbands who come home from the hard day of work out in that real world that they don't have access to. and they're going to wear something that matches with their interior setting. So they're one more beautiful object inside an interior setting filled with gorgeous objects. So here, everything you see here, that fabric on the sofa is just stunning. And here you have a painting above, and everything here is really quite beautiful. Here in Amelia Van Buren, she also is trapped, and she seems to be a little depressed. And in fact, she was diagnosed as suffering from neurasthenia. And I don't know if you know about that illness, but women were at this time by doctors were told that when you were having when it was that time of the month, when I was younger, and a lot of you are going to know what I'm talking about. Susie came to visit, right? My students, they're like, Susie, what are you talking about? Like, but anyway, women were considered to be suffering from depression and literally a wandering uterus. And they were diagnosed with this illness, and with this diagnosis, they were given bed rest and they weren't allowed to do anything. So we know Amelia Van Buren was diagnosed with this illness. So what happens is, at the end of the 19th century, and it's the period we're talking about here, the so-called New Woman emerges. And the New Woman is still going to dress in fashionable clothing, and here I can show you a fashion plate from a magazine, and these women are wearing the up-to-date fashion if you're going to be doing anything out of doors. And croquet is a brand new game that was just invented, and it's a game that is one of the first ones where women were being able to play out of doors with men playing the croquet. It was an acceptable activity for women. So the New Woman is emerging at this time, but there was a lot of resistance against the New Woman. But in Homer's work, he is definitely showing you the New Woman here. And she's much more independent, she's located outside, and she's not in the interior space. And she is going to become increasingly independent. So by the 1920s, she is going to become the flapper, and she's going to be wearing short skirts, heaven forbid, and high heels as well as stockings, again, heaven forbid, smoking a cigarette on that really long, whatever that's called here, I forgot what it's called. But it's really showing you, here you've got the cult of true womanhood, and she's looking down in a snobbish manner at her, and she's being really quite defiant. So by the time you get to the 1920s, the flapper, the New Woman, has really much more fully emerged. She is going to be working until she gets married. She is going to be, but the working is going to be like being a secretary, for example. Again, I'm talking about white middle-class women, I'm not talking about lower-class women. And she's going to be a lot more independent.
So we're really looking at this moment where ideas about women are changing, and I think the New Woman is such an important figure when we consider Newcomb College. So these are women who, for various reasons and circumstances, need to be able to make a living on their own, which is really quite revolutionary in this period. And so, Susan, you brought up some really wonderful points when we were talking about kind of the educational philosophies behind the curriculum at Newcomb College and these ideas. So if you could just tell us a little bit about why fine art training would be considered appropriate for women, that would be very helpful, I think, to our audience.
Well, there's several factors that come into play. And they go back as far as the arts and crafts movement in England, headed by William Morris, where the interiors of homes were decorated with handmade goods, handmade wallpaper, handmade drapery, handmade furniture, handmade desk accessories, and handmade pottery. and a lot of other things. And the idea was that you created this kind of utopian workshop where people had the time and the skill to make everything they made well designed, well executed. And so that had a lot of influence on the nature of the Newcomb Pottery School. Then there was also a movement to bring art education into the school systems. Previous to Ellsworth Woodward, there were less than like 30% of schools across the country that had any kind of art education. And a lot of educators at that time saw that this was a problem because we would be creating mediocre products, we would be creating inferior products that could not compete with the European market. So there was definitely a movement to improve the aesthetics of produced objects. Also, there was the desire to bring women into the workforce because a lot of women had, of course, lost their husbands in the Civil War, so there was a post-Civil War concern for people being able to support themselves and their families without the main breadwinner. And so women of, as Vivian said, middle and upper class needed to maintain their dignity by not going to work in factories. And so they're trying to create a contrast between the factory environment, which has a lot of clanging and a lot of fast movement, and contrasting it with a workshop where everybody, you can see in these photos and previous photos where it seems to be a very quiet and serene environment where people can take their time to create a beautiful design, take their time to execute it well, which is, counter to the goals of a factory. And women were encouraged into these workshops because they could bring to the workshops their domestic skills. They already had hand-eye coordination skills from their ability to, like you said, darn socks and cook, whatever. Also, they had a keen sense of detail. A lot of attention was paid to detail, and this kind of work required attention to every detail of the object. And they had a good sense of design because of their clothing and because of the jewelry they wore. So employing them in a workshop situation like Newcomb allowed them to explore creative talents and their intelligence.
I think that those are all really great kind of background information to see kind of the motivations of the students and the faculty. And I really like what you were saying about kind of traditional women's work. Whenever you're in the exhibition, so many of the things that we see are embroidery or jewelry, things that are associated with female adornment and traditional skills. But unfortunately, those skills also were often devalued in their period, so they weren't considered fine art, they're applied. And again, I think that those are great points about the arts and crafts movement's role in having us reevaluate these objects really as true artistic creations. But another thing that I think that relates to all of this idea of what these women should be doing that isn't going to ruffle anyone's feathers, some of those ideas get translated into the workshops at Newcomb Pottery. And I think one of the most surprising things that a lot of people learn about Newcomb is that the women who are training in the pottery aren't throwing the pots themselves. So Trinita, I'd love it if you could kind of walk us through the process that they used, and then we can really dive into what kind of motivated these decisions.
So when you do go through the exhibition, you'll notice that all of the pottery has a man's name on the label as well as a woman's name. And this is because there was a gender division of labor at Newcomb, and there was always a man to do the work that was considered the dirty work. So then there was a man there for 30 years named Joseph Meyer, and we actually see him in the photo in the upper left. And there he is at the potter's wheel. But he was the one who, and then his successors, they would source and mix the clay. And then they would throw the pot, and they would put it on a shelf for a female decorator to select. And you'll notice, actually, in kind of the second main space of the exhibition, we actually have a display that breaks down the process of creating a Newcomb pot. And there we have some of the instruments that the women use to kind of carve and sculpt their designs. And they started doing this around 1902. And that gave them a little bit more of creative input into the designs. Then the piece would be fired in the bisque firing process. And then after that is when they would paint the pot. So with brushes and with sponges, they would apply paint. And this is often called underglaze painting because it's done before the glaze was applied. So then the paint dried, and then a man would apply the glaze. And then it would go through a second firing supervised by the man. And then each piece was reviewed by the faculty. There was a jury. And actually, Newcomb had men and women on the faculty, so this is a joint effort. And then at that point, a piece would be placed for sale.
Can I ask you a question? So my question for you is, did this separation of spheres continue the entire time? So, and it really is an indication of even when the new woman emerges, she's still in this situation. There is no new woman, right?
So actually, as I said earlier, there were a lot of art potteries in the United States, and several of them did employ women. For example, Rokewood in Cincinnati employed women and men as pottery decorators. But there, again, the women weren't involved in throwing the pots. One of the few exceptions that I've found is there was a small pottery in Indiana called Overbeck that was run by 4 sisters. And there, the women still divided up the work. However, there was one who worked the kiln and one who worked at throwing the pots.
Rookwood, by the way, was the first woman-owned manufacturing business in the United States.
So we can really see that these ties between kind of female empowerment and pottery does have this correlation really kind of across the country. I'd also point out that there were art potteries founded, like one in Marblehead, called Marblehead, which was in New England, that actually was meant to train patients who were suffering from neurasthenia, that disorder that Vivian mentioned, to give them this kind of therapeutic outlet of expression and work. But to go back to these gendered practices, Susan, you had indicated some really kind of great observations about your own training as a ceramicist, and then a kind of drawing out to the bigger picture of educational practices about studio pottery versus workshops and the physicality of the work. So could you tell us a little more about that?
Sure. I have run production pottery operation for years, and before I became a full-time professor at Vanderbilt, I was part-time, so I ran a pottery business with up to 9 assistants. And then when I became full-time, I sort of flipped and now have a smaller operation. But when I had a big operation, it was a good idea actually to have the men doing the heavier work, because pottery making is very physical. So to throw pots that big, it requires a lot of weight of clay. And the clay kind of slings around, and so that would be an undignified look for a young lady to have her dress covered with mud. I mean, I even still get that today. People go, "Are you going to the store looking like that?" because I have a little bit of mud on my shirt and a little bit of clay on the bottom of my pants, and I assure them it's okay because most people in Smithville know who I am, but still there's a certain amount of shock involved with people going to the store looking dirty, so of course that would affect that era. But also just the lifting of pots in and out of kilns and the shelves that you put pots on to fire them were also heavy, so I completely understand the gender division of labor. Now, a lot of contemporary potters take a lot of pride in the exact opposite approach to running a studio, which is they do everything and they want people to know that. I was recently a juror for the Tennessee Craft Fair and did a little tour in relationship to this exhibition. And so when I was looking through all of the artist statements, I noticed that several of the potters took a great deal of pride in noting that they worked solely by themselves. They didn't want to be associated with like running a factory situation. But in those days, the women were thought to be more qualified for the design aspect because of their understanding of interior design and jewelry and fashion. So I've addressed the studio potter versus the workshop, the physicality of the work. And I also talked about Rokewood. So was there something else you wanted me to cover?
I think that you've done a wonderful job of kind of painting those distinctions. You also had mentioned kind of some gendered perceptions whenever you were in school about the type of work that was appropriate.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Or type of designs and things.
Right, well, that could be a period thing. Like when I was in school, it was a predominantly hippie sort of mentality that you approached pottery making with because it was a natural organic material and that you wanted to express the naturalness and kind of also influenced by the abstract expressionist painters where you did gestural, abstract, expressionistic imagery on the pot, which meant that that didn't really mean anything other than the gesture. So when I came along and I started doing things like flowers on pots and trees and landscapes, this seemed to be unacceptable. And then I introduced color, which was another faux pas in those days. But I thought I was being like a hippie of another kind because I wore blue jeans with patchwork and blue jeans with embroidered patches and brightly colored threads. So I didn't really understand why I didn't fit in, because my natural motifs I thought fit in with the back to nature sort of idealistic ideas of the hippie movement.
So it's interesting.
I didn't think I was being radical at all.
Well, it's interesting to see how these kind of preconceived ideas about what is art and what is appropriate and what kind of people's practices should be linger for a long time and take a while to really dispel. But I also wanted to point out at Newcomb Pottery something that's rather surprising, I think. So we've talked about this division of labor, and Trinita did a lovely job outlining that in the pottery and it was messy work. I mean, digging clays in the swamps and riverbeds of Louisiana and throwing the pots. But curiously enough, in the metalwork division, which Trinita Wright was 1902, a metalwork division was founded within the Newcomb Pottery Enterprise. Women handled every aspect of that production. So here we see this wonderful image of a woman with a blowtorch, because a kiln's too dangerous, but a blowtorch is just fine. And sharp objects and really hammering out bowls and some other beautiful metalwork that's up in the exhibition. So I think it's very striking that within the school that there would be this kind of mixed perception of what's appropriate work. So I think at this time it would, yes,
When we
Vivian.
were talking about this among ourselves, didn't one of us make the comment, but doing that, you're not getting dirty? Right?
Right.
So it's kind of interesting because we associate that with a masculine activity, but you can see they're holding this and it's at a distance, so they're not going to be messing themselves up the way Susan did.
still does.
That's very true. That is very, very true. And there's also, I think, that lingering association between women and their clothing and adornment. So a lot of the production was jewelry, so fine, detailed work. So that kind of picks up on things that both of you were saying about training and ideas about what's acceptable.
Well, and I also think it's a class thing, too, that lower class, working class, lower middle class people get dirty when they work, whereas upper class and middle class people work with their minds and don't get dirty. So there's a class distinction as well as a gender distinction.
I think hearing all of this, it makes us very happy that we've advanced beyond this in many, many regards, so that academic training isn't regimented like this, and our ideas about the workplace. But returning to the pots themselves, I think an exploration of the decorative motifs at Newcomb would be helpful as well. So Trinita, perhaps you could tell us just a little bit about the style and subject matter that was used at Newcomb.
So one of the tenets of Newcomb pottery was that every piece should be unique unless a customer asked for uniformity. So there are, for example, some dining sets where the plates all match. But in general, each piece was intended to be unique, and even though some of the same motifs occur in similar objects, each one really is different. So what the comparison here is between two plates. Both have a cactus design, but they're by two different women, and you can see that they interpret the motif in different ways, using different colors. The incised lines are deeper on the plate on the right. Now, some of you may be familiar with the moon and moss motif of Newcomb pottery. This was introduced sometime between 1908 and 1915, and even earlier there were examples of treescapes in Newcomb pottery, but kind of in the early 20th century they developed the moon and moss motif, which is evocative of the southern landscape, specifically the bayous of Louisiana. So you see a bayou with a palm tree or a live oak. And this is a motif that was very popular with the buying public. And in fact, some sales agents requested that Newcomb pottery only send them the moon and moss. And we have a case in the exhibition that has several examples, including these three right here. The decorators actually became very tired of this motif very quickly. And Anna Frances Simpson was considered the most talented moon and moss decorator. Sadie Irvine is the one who claims credit for it. But in the 1920s and 30s, this is something that they started to repeat, even though everyone is unique. And actually, Sadie Irvine, she was at the Newcomb pottery for a half a century, and she really started to break barriers around 1940, a little bit earlier perhaps, and she started focusing more on the glazes. And she still remained true to the idea of being inspired by the local environment, but she did things like the vase on the left that is inspired by the green of moss that you see on trees. So it's a more abstract notion rather than being so literal. And this vase on the right is actually one of my favorite in the entire exhibition. It's inspired by the cafe au lait that is so popular in New Orleans. So it's called mocha ware, mocha glaze. But I think that she really shows her creativity in these late pieces.
And so I think that tension between industry, so you talked about the decorators getting kind of tired of this repetition. I think that that's something that is also kind of speaks to the creative spirit. And Susan, I'd love it if you could talk to us a little bit more about that, and about that negotiating that balance between a studio pottery and personal expression?
Well, in the case of Newcomb Pottery, they had certain styles, certain motifs, certain designs that were repeated over and over again, but the shapes changed, and so there was a certain elasticity to a design. And like Trinita said, that you might have the same design, but you emphasize the negative space more, you change up the colors, you blow up the leaves more than the flower, you place the flower in a different location on the piece depending on the shape. So that's actually kind of how a lot of artists work. They do variations on a theme, and they set up their own parameters and then explore answers to that problem. And so with setting up the problem like that, in art there's more than one right answer. So that's how come you don't have to have a manufactured item where this one looks exactly like this one, exactly like that one. You have many that work within those limitations and confines, but they all are perfectly beautiful solutions to the problem. Is that what you're talking about?
Absolutely. I think that's a beautiful description, because in some ways I think that the Newcomb Pottery's insistence on the flora and fauna, and this idea that it's dictated to the workers there kind of galls some of us, I think, perhaps a little bit, or it can create a perception that creativity is being limited. And I love how you're describing that, yes, there are confines, but that there are really wonderful ways of expressing yourself within those.
Right. If you're going to have a successful economic model, you do have to have a certain level of efficiency in the plan. Otherwise, it costs more to make the product than you can charge for the product, and you don't have a profitable situation.
Yes, so, and that very much, I think, speaks to the idea that Newcomb has a look that's marketable. And Trinita, your example of these later pots that were more abstract, even though perhaps they fit in more with predominant kind of tastes of the period. Susan, you had mentioned things where glaze and gesture are overtaking the importance of figurative work. Even still, because Newcomb is ingrained in this idea that it needs to be literal and representational, it's working against them and ultimately leads to the Pottery Enterprise's closure. Is that right, Trinita? When did it close?
1940.
So, yes, it closes in 1940, and there are a number of factors that lead to the closure. But one of them is that the pottery program wasn't attracting as many women at the time. Actually, looking at it from a positive point of view, there were more avenues opening to women besides pottery.
Well, moving to kind of a little bit of a post-Newcomb, Susan, you supplied us with these wonderful images of your work from your studio pottery and your designs. So I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit more about your method and inspiration.
Well, obviously I'm a little inspired by Newcomb because I like the taking the roundness of the piece and repeating the pattern or having an alternate repetition. Like on the rim here you have the alternating burgundy flower, and then inside the bowl you have the alternating yellow flower, and then the background it's yellow and alternates. So there's multiple patterns of repetition. And I have done, literally hundreds and hundreds of pieces with the melty flower motif, and when you get a successful image like that, you try it on, well, okay, it worked really well on bowls, let's try it on vases. And so there's a similarity here in that you put the most interesting part of the design on the high spot of the pot, like where when the viewer first sees the pot, they're looking at the shoulder or they're looking at the high spot of the belly. And so then you have the veins or you have the leaves or the stems running down the length of the pot, and that dramatizes the pot's tallness. In my situation, I have the glaze actually melting down the side to dramatize the long part of the form.
It's really a lovely melding of these representational motifs and then a really expressive glaze pattern and beautiful forms. I think the ladies of Newcomb would be proud to have you as an heir to their style and motifs.
Well, I would also note that their favorite colors were blue and green, and I do have a lot of blue and green. And when I went to school, it was a complete no-no to use blue. And so I love the color blue, and a lot of my customers love the color blue. So I really had to ignore that, a criticism of my work.
It's funny, sometimes the public doesn't know what they want until they get it, correct? And this is the final example that you had shared, or that we had discussed. Maybe you could tell us a bit about it.
Well, the pottery, Newcomb Pottery used indigenous imagery in their work. And so when I moved to Middle Tennessee, which is so beautiful, I started using tree motifs and flower motifs. And then I started using like more dramatic images, like this is a Tennessee tornado. And you can see the hills in the background and the tornadoes coming toward you. And you can see the wind is blowing the trees in the background so that the branches are almost pulling over. And then in the middle ground, you can see the leaves. I remember I've never actually been through or seen a tornado, but of course I see them in the news all the time. And we did have a really big windstorm, and the leaves were blown off the trees and were plastered on everything. So that's where the leaves in the middle come from, is the wind being so strong that blew all the leaves off the trees. And it's in a little window because I'm like looking out the window to see if I should be, running for dear life from this tornado. But the Newcomb Pottery also used little geometric motifs to square off different sections of a piece.
And so I think thank you. Again, they're really beautiful pieces, and it's not an extended commercial, but her work is available in the gift shop. If you'd like to even just put your eyes on it, I think one of the other things with pottery is seeing it and touching the work is really important to kind of evaluating it and to understanding how it would be used.
Can I say one more thing?
Sure.
There are other potters in the gift shop who do the Newcomb approach to pottery surface enrichment, which is carving. And I can't think of her name at the moment. I'm having a mental block. But you do the carving of the image, and then I guess it's kind of too technical for people that don't know, but the underglaze is actually a metallic oxide that's been mixed with water, like copper carbonate makes green and cobalt carbonate makes blue. And so if those metallic oxides are pounded down into a powder and mixed with water, you can brush them over the carved texture and then kind of hit the high spots with a sponge, and so the coloration will be denser in the texture and less dense, and then you cover it with that clear glaze they're talking about. And so there's a woman, Audrey, who does that with her work, and she also does local fauna.
Yes, Audrey Deal McEver, I think is her name.
Thank you.
But that was a really beautiful, I think, discussion of what it was like to apply the surface ornamentation. When we looked at Trinita's kind of breakdown of the division of labor, one could get the kind of false impression that the men are doing the lion's share of the work, I think, by it. But when we understand these underglaze processes and carving, we really see the level of artistry involved in these pots. And so they really are a testament, I think, to the ingenuity and creativity of these women. But just to wrap us up, Vivian, during our discussions, you brought up some really great connections to how Newcomb related to kind of where art went afterward, and what kind of the perception of female creativity and how that changed.
So I talked about the separation of spheres and the emergence of the new woman, but one thing that I didn't talk about is the fact that ceramics is considered to be a female creation, just like sewing or embroidery. So that was not considered to be quote-unquote high art. If you were a high art artist, and I'm now moving into the 1970s with the women's movement or the feminist movement, if you were going to be creating paintings on a large scale. So in the in the 1970s, Judy Chicago, had, in California, decided that she was going to teach only women students in an art school, and she was going to encourage women to become artists and to become professional artists. And she created this work that's known as the Dinner Party. It's now located in the Brooklyn Museum of Art in New York. And what she did with this, it's a collaborative effort in which she herself learned how to make pottery, and she learned and had other people assist her in doing embroidery, and everything that you see here is handcrafted. And what she is saying is that, number one, an artist is not working by himself, like Leonardo da Vinci or Jackson Pollock, to create a work of art, but instead is collaborating with a lot of other women, so hundreds of women did this. Number two, that women could be doing what would be considered craft, but now it is within the context of being a high art. And she is creating this dinner table with 33 placemats dedicated to 33 women who have been excluded from history, and reinserting them into her story. And then this is, can we go back just 1 minute? Or you can see the ceramic floor here and then go forward, thank you. And you see the writing on the ceramic floor right behind the plate. There are 999 names of other women in history who have been forgotten. So for us today, we forget how far we've come. And, but nevertheless, in 1970, this is very, very radical to reinsert these women. So each place setting is dedicated to a particular woman who has been forgotten, at least in the 1970s. Virginia Woolf, you may know, wrote an amazing book, A Room of One's Own. She was a writer who had been ignored in the feminist movement. In fact, I took the first women's studies course at Ohio State University as an undergraduate in 1970, and we studied Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own. So Judy is dedicating this to all of these forgotten women. And these are the plates that she and her other people worked. All these settings that you see here are done by the women. Even the goblets are done by them. And if you take a look at the form of the plate, the circular form, what Judy Chicago argued, and other feminist critics at the time, they argued that women automatically would focus on circular forms. And you see it over and over and over here. And they argued that these circular forms were unique to women. So Lucy Lepard, for example, a critic, had also made this comment. And that women are always going to be focusing on the circular form. And then when Judy takes it one step further, and she deliberately is creating this circular motif that looks similar to the female anatomy. It's called vaginal iconography. And she's pretty much saying, you know, the phallus, you can see the flying phallus in ancient Greek art, for example. And she's saying, well, let's have this form and let's celebrate this. So I really think, I don't know if Judy, and I should have asked her before I came in, I should have emailed her to say, did you know about the Newcomb Pottery? I'm sure she did.
Well, and really, this is also, I think, going full circle from not studying anatomy to focusing on it. And from and really having a contemporary artist, and of course, Judy Chicago is now so kind of ingrained in the way that contemporary art is taught to undergraduate students and graduate students and artists and art historians as well. But she really is taking these motifs, and she's also taking these crafts that are, I think, emblematic of Newcomb and translating them so that we're seeing them in an entirely different light. We have time for just a couple of questions. So does anyone in the audience have any questions for us today? We probably have time for one or two. Well, if not, I'm sure that those of us on the panel would be happy to chat with you afterward. If you haven't seen the exhibition Women, Art, and Social Change, I invite you to do so. It's on view at the Frist Center through November 6th. I also hope that you'll come back and see us for our next Food for Thought program, which will be on November 29th and focuses on samurai, the way of the warrior. So something entirely different.
Speaking of gender differences.
And I'd like to thank our panelists, Susan, Vivian, and Trinita, for all their works. Thank you.
Thank you.